You were never meant to shed your past like a snake leaving its old skin in the wilderness. You were meant to carry it as a living archive of everything consciousness has ever tried to understand through you. Yet, somewhere along the path of self-development, you absorbed the idea that growth means elimination, that the versions of you that struggled, feared, broke, or hesitated must be destroyed in order for you to rise. But identity has never been an act of burning, it is an act of gathering. Consciousness does not erase, it accumulates. Every season of your life imprints itself onto you the way the universe imprints gravity onto matter, subtle, invisible, yet undeniably binding. What you call you is not a singular structure, but a constellation of selves that formed at different altitudes of awareness. The you who loved without caution, the you who trusted too quickly, the you who held silence because speaking felt dangerous, the you who hid, who tried, who failed, who learned. None of them vanished. They are layered within you like ancient geological sediment, storing everything you once believed you needed to survive. And this is what most people never realize. You don't outgrow your former selves, you incorporate them. Your evolution is not a ladder reaching upward, it is a spiral returning inward. Growth is not the elimination of who you were, it is the expansion of who you are. Every healed moment, every integrated lesson, every softened memory adds a new ring to the tree of your consciousness. Not one is wasted, not one is irrelevant, not one is disposable. Yet most of your suffering comes from believing that parts of you must be cut away for the rest of you to thrive. You try to silence the younger self who once panicked, you bury the version who once loved someone who hurt them, you reject the self who acted out of fear, you exile the identity that made choices you now regret. But your consciousness is not a battlefield between who you were and who you want to become. It is a home, and every version of you is a room you must one day revisit. Identity is accumulation because consciousness cannot discard experience. It metabolizes it. Even the most painful chapters do not rot, they ferment, waiting for you to return with wiser eyes, so that what once felt like poison can become medicine. What once made you hide now teaches you to see. What once made you afraid now reveals your capacity for resilience. What once broke you now becomes architecture for compassion. This is the secret most people miss. The parts of you that embarrass you, frustrate you, or terrify you are not mistakes. They are blueprints. They are signatures. They are markers of your evolution waiting to be reclaimed. You are not standing on the ashes of who you were. You are standing on the shoulders of every self that dared to exist before you arrived here. To destroy the past would be to destroy the very soil your current self is rooted in. And consciousness has never grown by cutting its roots. It grows by remembering them. So, before you journey deeper into releasing, integrating, or transforming the layers of your past, you must understand this fundamental truth. Nothing inside you was ever meant to be discarded. Everything inside you was meant to be included. When you see identity not as destruction, but as accumulation, you stop fighting who you were and start understanding who you are becoming. Emotional residue. Why unintegrated versions of you reappear through triggers. There are moments when something small, a tone of voice, a familiar silence, a certain expression on someone's face awakens a reaction inside you that feels far bigger than the moment deserves. You tell yourself you're overreacting. You assume you're being irrational. You wonder why you're suddenly flooded with emotion when nothing significant happened. But this surge has nothing to do with the present. What you're feeling is emotional residue, the signal of a younger self pressing against the surface of your awareness, asking to be acknowledged. A trigger is not an explosion, it is an echo. It's the reverberation of an experience that was never fully absorbed by your nervous system. The body remembers what the mind abandoned, and the heart stores what your survival instincts could not afford to face. The parts of you that felt unsafe, unseen, unprotected, or unheard didn't disappear when you moved on, they simply waited. Emotional residue is not a flaw in your healing. It is the imprint of a moment when a previous version of you didn't have the capacity to complete a feeling. At that time, your system did exactly what it needed to do to survive. It postponed, it froze, it compartmentalized. It preserved the unfinished emotion like a sealed envelope, storing it in a corner of your consciousness until the day you became strong enough to open it without breaking. Every trigger is the universe tapping your shoulder, saying, "You're ready now." But because you've been taught to fear your intensity, you interpret triggers as regressions. You believe their return means you've undone your progress. You think you're slipping backward into old patterns. Yet the truth is more compassionate. Emotional residue reappears only when you have developed the strength, stability, and consciousness required to integrate it. A trigger is a reunion, not a failure. It is the arrival of a past self whose story you never fully heard, and it comes with a message encoded in sensation, the tightness in your chest, the shaking in your hands, the sudden rise of heat or stillness. These are not emotional malfunctions. They are coordinates guiding you to the place where you left yourself behind. When something in the present feels disproportionately painful, it's because a part of you is living at a different emotional timestamp. The present moment becomes a mirror, reflecting an older moment you never resolved. The person in front of you becomes a reminder of someone who once hurt you or abandoned you or misunderstood you. The situation becomes a doorway into the emotional memory still vibrating in your system. And although your mind insists that this is about the person or the event happening now, your body knows the truth. This has nothing to do with today. This is a call from yesterday. What reappears through triggers is not the trauma, it's the self who endured it, the child who wasn't defended, the adolescent who carried wounds silently, the adult who didn't yet know how to breathe through their fear. These selves are not returning to paralyze you. They are returning because they trust you now in a way they couldn't trust you before. Emotional residue is the evidence that a part of you survived long enough to be healed. And when you understand that every trigger is a communication rather than a catastrophe, something within you softens. Instead of fighting the reaction, you listen. Instead of suppressing it, you stay. Instead of treating the past like an enemy, you begin to treat it like a messenger. And this, quietly but profoundly, marks the beginning of integration. Your old selves reappear not to pull you backward, but to bring themselves forward into the safety of who you have finally become. The law of energetic conservation within consciousness. In the physical universe, nothing is ever truly lost. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, it only changes form. Einstein whispered this truth through E equals mc squared. Bohm expanded it by describing the universe as an unbroken wholeness in constant flux. And while these ideas transformed our understanding of physics, what most people never realize is that the same law operates within the inner universe of human consciousness. Nothing you have ever felt has vanished. Nothing you have ever feared has dissolved. Nothing you have ever loved has disappeared. Every emotion, every thought, every experience is a frequency in the field of your awareness. And frequencies do not die. They echo, they transmute, they wait for resonance, but they do not disappear. This is the law of energetic conservation within consciousness. Just as the cosmos recycles stardust into planets, organisms, and galaxies, your inner world recycles emotional energy into patterns, behaviors, reactions, and revelations. The anger you ignored becomes tension. The grief you suppressed becomes withdrawal. The joy you denied yourself becomes longing. Energy doesn't leave, it reorganizes. This is why you cannot run from yourself. You can only encounter yourself in new forms. When an old emotional pattern resurfaces, it isn't a sign that you're stuck. It's evidence that consciousness is attempting to reorganize itself into clarity. The energy of that past moment has completed a cycle and returned for integration, not to haunt you, but to harmonize you. We often speak about moving on from things we don't want to feel. But consciousness doesn't move on, it moves through. Every unprocessed emotion is like a wave that never reached the shore. It remains suspended in your internal ocean, waiting for the moment when your awareness is stable enough to let it land. This is why healing often feels non-linear. One day, you're calm. The next day, you're suddenly overwhelmed. Then, without warning, you feel peaceful again. It's not inconsistency, it's physics. Your consciousness is cycling through emotional energy that was once too overwhelming for your younger self to hold. But now, with a more expanded awareness, the energy seeks completion. And completion is never violent, it is a homecoming. The law of conservation explains another overlooked truth. When you reject a part of yourself, the energy of that part does not vanish, it fragments. It becomes a splinter of unresolved consciousness floating within your field, influencing you from behind the curtain. It shapes decisions you don't understand. It fuels reactions you don't want. It whispers fears you thought you'd outgrown. The energy you disown doesn't weaken, it intensifies. But when you finally turn toward it, when you stop resisting and start witnessing, it softens, it begins to return to the whole. Awareness is the alchemy that reorganizes fragmented energy back into coherence. This is why the mere act of acknowledging a long-buried emotion can reduce its charge by half. You haven't solved it, you haven't transcended it, but you've brought it out of isolation, and energy in connection behaves differently than energy in exile. It becomes fluid again, it begins to move. Your consciousness is not a graveyard of old selves. It is a living ecosystem governed by the same universal laws that shape stars and seas. Every version of you is still alive within your field, not as a burden, but as energy awaiting transformation. And when you understand this, you stop fearing the emotional storms that rise within you. You start seeing them as weather patterns returning to balance. Nothing in you is trying to destroy you. Everything in you is trying to return to wholeness. Memory fields as living archives influencing present behavior. Memory is not a photograph stored in the mind. It is a field alive, dynamic, and vibrational. It does not sit passively in the brain like a file waiting to be opened. It moves through you, shaping your reactions, preferences, instincts, and expectations long before you have time to consciously interpret what you're feeling. Memory fields are not relics of the past. They are living archives influencing the present. Neuroscience tells us that the brain encodes experiences as networks of neural firing. Mysticism tells us that the soul encodes experiences as patterns of energetic resonance. The truth is that both are describing the same phenomenon. Memory is a living imprint that persists across layers of consciousness, and, because it is living, it interacts with your life in real time. This is why you sometimes feel a sense of danger in a moment that is objectively safe. The environment hasn't threatened you, but the memory field has awakened. It's why you may sabotage a good relationship even when nothing is wrong. The person in front of you hasn't betrayed you, but the memory field of betrayal activates as if it were happening again. It's why certain opportunities feel overwhelming despite your readiness. You're not incapable, an older memory field is still vibrating at the frequency of a time when you were. Memory doesn't live in the past, it lives in the present until it is integrated. Every unresolved moment creates a field of emotional charge, a subtle gravity that pulls your attention, your reactions, and your choices toward unfinished business. And because these fields operate below conscious awareness, you often interpret their influence as instinct, personality, or intuition, when in truth it is just history speaking in the language of sensation. You think you know why you react the way you do. But much of your behavior isn't coming from the you who stands here today. It is coming from the archive of selves that formed who you've been. These fields are holographic. A small moment in the present can activate an entire archive from the past. A raised voice can awaken the memory of every time you weren't heard. A moment of rejection can light up the memory field of every time you weren't chosen. A sudden loss of control can summon the memory field of every moment your boundaries were violated. The past does not return as images. It returns as frequency. This is why logic alone cannot dissolve your patterns. You cannot reason with a memory field because it is not intellectual, it is energetic, and energy does not respond to arguments. It responds to awareness. The moment you bring presence to the reaction instead of fear, the field begins to soften. The moment you stay conscious through a trigger instead of abandoning yourself, the archive begins to reorganize. The moment you stop collapsing into the story and start witnessing the sensation, memory transitions from something that controls you to something that teaches you. You don't heal by erasing the archive. You heal by updating it. Your memory fields are not static, they are editable. Every time you respond differently to an old emotional pattern, the archive shifts. Every time you hold yourself through a reaction without self-judgment, the field rewrites itself. Every time you choose awareness over avoidance, the old blueprint dissolves into a new one. This is the living brilliance of consciousness. Your past remains alive, not to imprison you, but to evolve alongside you. The difference between rejection and remembrance in healing. Healing begins to fracture the moment you believe it requires rejecting who you once were. You think you must distance yourself from the old self, the one who made mistakes, trusted too deeply, stayed too long, reacted too strongly, or loved without boundaries. You assume progress demands a clean break, but rejection is not healing. Rejection is another wound placed on top of an older one. What you push away does not leave, it grows sharper in the dark. When you reject a former version of yourself, you are not erasing them, you are exiling them, and every exiled self becomes a silent gravitational force pulling at your emotions from beneath the surface. They do not vanish, they wait. They wait for a door to open, a moment of weakness, a familiar trigger, a crack in your defenses that allows them to speak again. And when they do, you misinterpret their return as failure instead of an invitation. Remembrance is different. Remembrance is the act of meeting your former self with understanding instead of shame. Remembrance is the awareness that every decision you once made was the best you could make with the consciousness you had at the time. Remembrance is the willingness to look at the younger you, not with criticism, but with compassion. Rejection says, I never want to be that again. Remembrance says, I understand why you were that. And that simple shift changes everything. When you reject your old selves, they remain fragmented, disconnected from the whole. They operate unconsciously, influencing behavior from behind the curtain. But when you remember them, you draw them into the light. You let them speak. You let them be seen. And in the moment they are acknowledged, the emotional charge begins to dissolve. Rejection freezes. Remembrance frees. The truth is that your healing does not require you to judge who you were. It requires you to embrace who you were. Because the self you reject is often the self who protected you. The one who endured what you didn't have the tools to process. The one who survived for you. The one who believed what they needed to believe to keep you moving forward. When you reject that self, you reject your own resilience. Remembrance does not excuse the pain you've felt or the choices you regret. It contextualizes them. It gives the past a place to rest. It transforms your history from a threat into a teacher. You cannot hate the version of yourself who didn't know better and expect the version who knows better to flourish. This is the paradox of healing. The acceptance you withhold from your past becomes the acceptance you cannot access in the present. Because healing is not the art of becoming someone new, it is the art of becoming someone whole. Rejection builds walls inside you. Remembrance builds bridges. When you remember your old self with gentleness, something extraordinary happens. The tightness in your chest loosens. The judgment in your mind softens. The story you carry rewrites itself. And the emotional residue that once overwhelmed you begins to integrate. Because remembrance opens the door for your past selves to come home not as burdens, but as reclaimed energy. Healing is not a battle between who you were and who you are becoming. It is a dialogue. A quiet, compassionate conversation between every version of you that has ever existed. You don't evolve by rejecting your former selves. You evolve by remembering them, listening to them, and allowing them to take their rightful place within your wholeness. How forgiveness reabsorbs fragmented energy. Forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood forces in human consciousness. People imagine it as a moral gesture, a noble act, or a gift extended to someone who wronged them. But forgiveness is not charity. It is not mercy. It is not forgetting. Forgiveness is energetic return, the moment when a fractured part of your consciousness comes home. Every time you experience something overwhelming, the emotional intensity can split a piece of your awareness from the whole. A fragment forms. A version of you becomes frozen in time, holding the shock, the grief, the anger, or the confusion you didn't have the capacity to process. That piece stays there, suspended in emotional amber, replaying the same feeling over and over again until the day you are ready to retrieve it. Forgiveness is the retrieval. It is the reopening of an inner door you once slammed shut. It is the moment when your present self turns toward the past with enough strength, clarity, and compassion to absorb what once broke you. You do not forgive because the past was acceptable. You forgive because carrying the fragment is no longer sustainable. The world tells you forgiveness is for the other person, but consciousness reveals the opposite. Forgiveness is the mechanism through which your energy returns to you. When you hold resentment, pain, or unfinished emotion toward a person or event, a part of your essence remains entangled with that moment. Your life force becomes stuck in a loop of repetition, replaying the wound with every memory, every trigger, every reaction. Forgiveness breaks the loop not by erasing the memory, but by reintegrating the energy trapped inside it. This is why forgiveness often brings an immediate sensation of release. The body softens, the breath expands, the nervous system unwinds. These physiological shifts are signs that a piece of your consciousness has rejoined the whole. You aren't becoming lighter because the world has changed. You're becoming lighter because you are becoming more complete. Forgiveness does not mean your past was justified. It means your present deserves your full energy. When you refuse to forgive, the fragment stays frozen. It becomes part of your identity, coloring your perception, shaping your relationships, influencing your behavior. You begin to expect harm where there is none. You anticipate betrayal from innocent people. You project old shadows onto new experiences. The past becomes a lens you cannot remove because part of you is still trapped inside it. But when you forgive not blindly, not prematurely, but consciously, you reclaim the energy that was lost to that moment. The fragment dissolves back into the core of your being, and the memory shifts from something active to something integrated. It no longer pulls at your behavior or hijacks your emotional responses. It simply becomes part of your story, no longer part of your suffering. Forgiveness is not a collapse, it is a merging. It is not surrendering your boundaries. It is reclaiming your boundaries from an old wound. It is not letting someone else win. It is letting yourself return to wholeness. And here is the deepest truth. The person you most need to forgive is rarely the one who hurt you. It is the version of yourself who endured it. The you who stayed. The you who froze. The you who didn't speak. The you who was afraid to walk away. The you who tried too hard to be loved. You cannot reclaim the energy of those versions until you forgive them for what they didn't know, didn't have, or didn't understand. And when you do, the fragments return. The self repairs. Consciousness becomes whole again. Forgiveness is not the end of pain, it is the end of fragmentation. It is the moment when every part of you begins to come home. Rebirth as restoration. Every ending hides a return. We speak about rebirth as if it is a new beginning pulled from the ashes of who we once were. But rebirth is not a replacement. It is not the arrival of a new self that erases the old. Rebirth is restoration, the moment when consciousness circles back to reclaim what was left behind. Every ending you've experienced was not destruction. It was a turning point, a dissolving of form so that what was essential could return in a purer state. Nothing in you ever truly ends. It simply goes into hiding until you're ready to meet it again. Think of the self as a constellation. Stars appear to vanish at dawn, but their light never disappears. It only becomes unseen until the right conditions reveal it again. The same is true for the parts of you that faded during hardship, the confidence you once held, the innocence you lost, the hope you buried, the bravery you forgot. These qualities never died. They receded. They protected themselves in the dark until your consciousness grew strong enough to hold them without breaking. Rebirth is their return. But because the return often comes wrapped in discomfort, you misinterpret it as decline, the resurfacing of old feelings, the sudden heaviness, the sense of being back where you started. You assume the cycle is repeating because you failed, but it's repeating because you've evolved. You are revisiting the same emotional landscape with a new layer of awareness. You're not breaking down, you're integrating. Rebirth is not a forward motion, it is a spiral inward. Every emotional collapse you've experienced was not a fall from grace, but a fall into yourself, a descent into a layer of memory or identity that had remained untouched. And when you reach that layer, you meet the version of yourself who was left behind, the one who didn't finish grieving, the one who didn't feel safe enough to speak, the one who wasn't ready to let go, the one who needed more time. Rebirth happens the moment you sit with that version instead of abandoning it again, and that is why endings feel so heavy. Something inside you knows that a return is coming. A return to a truth you once ignored, a pain you once outran, a dream you once postponed, or a strength you once doubted. The ending clears the noise so the return can be heard. Rebirth is not about becoming someone else. It is about remembering who you were before fear rewrote your story. This is why certain qualities begin to reappear in you unexpectedly. The spontaneity you lost resurfaces in small bursts. The courage you forgot begins to whisper. The boundaries you never had start forming on their own. You find yourself acting in ways that feel strangely familiar, as though an older, wiser version of you has stepped back into the room. Because it has. Rebirth is restoration. It is the self recalibrating to its original blueprint, not the blueprint shaped by trauma or expectation, but the one written before you learned to doubt yourself. And as each forgotten part returns, your inner architecture becomes stronger, more coherent, more unified. Every ending carries a hidden message. You left something behind. Go back and retrieve it. And when you finally gather these parts, when you stop seeing endings as losses and start seeing them as invitations, something extraordinary happens. The weight lifts. The confusion softens. The path clears. because nothing in you was ever meant to be discarded, only reclaimed, restored, and returned to the whole. Rebirth is not a new beginning. It is the homecoming of everything you once were, everything you lost, and everything you are ready to hold at last. Gratitude toward the outdated self as alchemical release. There comes a moment in your evolution when you realize that the self you once outgrew was never your enemy. It was your scaffolding. It was the temporary architecture that allowed you to survive long enough to become who you are now. Yet most people look back on their outdated selves with embarrassment, resentment, or shame. They cringe at their old decisions, their past naivety, their former patterns. They judge the version of themselves who didn't see clearly, didn't choose wisely, didn't act courageously. But judgment traps the past in place. Gratitude sets it free. Gratitude toward your outdated self is the alchemical process through which emotional density transforms into wisdom. It is the moment when what once felt like weight becomes fuel. When you look at the former, you not with mockery but with reverence. Because that outdated self, awkward, messy, afraid, hopeful, confused, was the one who carried you through terrain. Your present self no longer remembers how to navigate. The outdated self is the one who endured the heartbreak your wiser self now understands. It is the one who took risks, your grounded self now analyses. It is the one who believed in things your awakened self has outgrown. Without that self, you could not exist today. Gratitude is not nostalgia. It is acknowledgement. It is the recognition that every version of you, even the ones you'd rather forget, played a precise role in your becoming. The moments you call mistakes were actually turning points. The moments you call weakness were actually adaptations. The moments you call failure were actually foundations. And the self who lived through those moments did so without the clarity you now possess. That self navigated life with limited tools and still managed to move forward, still managed to hope, still managed to dream, even in distorted ways, still managed to survive what could have destroyed them. Gratitude turns that truth into liberation. When you begin thanking your outdated self, something extraordinary happens. The tightness in your chest loosens. The emotional residue inside the memory softens. What once felt heavy becomes strangely tender, because gratitude is the only emotional frequency that can fully dissolve shame, and shame is what binds your past selves in exile. You cannot integrate a version of yourself that you secretly despise. You cannot heal a version of yourself that you judge as foolish, but you can reclaim a version of yourself you appreciate. Gratitude is what opens the door. Suddenly, the choices you made back then make sense. You see the innocence behind them. You see the confusion behind them. You see the courage behind them. You realize that your outdated self wasn't sabotaging your future. They were doing the best they could with the consciousness they had. And in that realization, the emotional charge begins to evaporate. The memory stops gripping you. The pattern stops repeating. The trigger loses its power. Gratitude acts like light entering a dark room. The shadows dissolve, not because they were defeated, but because they were understood. This is the alchemy of gratitude. It transforms your past from a burden into a teacher. It transforms your outdated self from a mistake into an ancestor. It transforms your history from fragmentation into fuel. When you can finally say, "Thank you," to the person you once were, you are no longer trapped in who they had to be. You inherit their lessons without inheriting their pain. You receive their story without repeating their cycle. And the past finally becomes what it was always meant to be, not a cage, but a bridge. Merging past frequencies to create wholeness in the present. Wholeness is not something you build, it is something you remember. And the remembering happens the moment the frequencies of your past selves those scattered, silenced, forgotten versions, are finally allowed to return to your present awareness. Each of them carries a fragment of your original light. Each of them holds a piece of your instinct, your intuition, your creativity, your courage, your softness, your power. But because you spent years rejecting them, their energy remained fragmented, vibrating at different emotional timestamps inside you. To merge these frequencies is to reclaim your full spectrum. Every version of you vibrates at the frequency of the emotional era in which they were born. The child who felt unsafe vibrates differently than the teenager who felt misunderstood. The young adult who feared rejection vibrates differently than the seeker who longed for meaning. And because these frequencies remained unintegrated, your consciousness became a symphony, playing out of tune, each part performing its own emotional melody without connection to the whole. Merging begins when you stop treating these selves as intruders and start treating them as instruments waiting to be tuned. When an old fear arises, it doesn't mean you've regressed, it means a frequency is asking to be harmonized. When a familiar insecurity surfaces, it doesn't mean you're broken, it means a younger vibration is rising to match your current awareness. When you feel drawn to patterns you thought you'd outgrown, it doesn't mean you're failing, it means a fragment is approaching the threshold of reintegration. You merge frequencies not by resisting them, but by witnessing them. Awareness is the conductor that brings discordant energies into coherence. When you feel the fear without believing the story behind it, the frequency begins to shift. When you recognize an emotion without collapsing into it, the vibration moves closer to your present self. When you breathe through the discomfort instead of abandoning it, the fragmented energy begins to dissolve into your current field. Integration happens not through force, but through resonance. And resonance occurs when different vibrations meet without judgment. This is why self-compassion is not sentimental, it is vibrational physics. Compassion lowers the internal resistance that keeps emotional frequencies fragmented. The moment you soften, the frequencies draw closer. The moment you stop fighting your reactions, your system stabilizes. And the moment you stop demanding perfection, the parts of you holding pain can finally breathe. As the frequencies merge, something remarkable happens. Your reactions become slower. Your patterns lose their intensity. Your emotional landscape becomes clearer. Your decisions become less entangled with the past, because what once operated as separate selves begins to operate as one. This merging creates coherence, the state where all parts of your consciousness vibrate in harmony with the present moment. It is what the HeartMath Institute observed in the body, what mystics described as inner alignment, what physicists recognize as a unified field. Wholeness is coherence. Coherence is the absence of internal conflict. And the absence of internal conflict is not silence, it is harmony. When your past selves merge with your present awareness, you expand. You gain the innocence of your younger self without losing the wisdom of your current self. You gain the courage you once lost without forgetting the discernment you earned. You gain the softness you once buried without sacrificing the boundaries you've built. The fragmented becomes fluid, the outdated becomes relevant, the wounded becomes wise. Merging past frequencies does not create a new version of you. It reveals the version that was always hidden beneath the noise of unintegrated emotion, the whole self, the coherent self, the self that remembers who they were before they forgot. Wholeness is not the outcome of healing. Wholeness is the return to the truth that you were never incomplete. You don't transcend your former selves. You evolve by inviting them home. You have spent much of your life trying to transcend who you once were. You've been taught that growth means outgrowing, that healing means detaching, that awakening means abandoning the versions of you that lived in shadow or fear. But the deeper you travel into consciousness, the clearer the truth becomes. Evolution is not the art of leaving yourself behind. It is the art of returning to every part of you that ever called out for love. You don't transcend your former selves by rising above them. You evolve by turning toward them. The spiritual world often romanticizes ascension, a climbing upward, a shedding of weight, a leaving of the old life behind. But consciousness does not ascend by escaping density. It ascends by integrating it. The light you discover in awakening is not found somewhere beyond your history. It is found within the history you finally learned to embrace. Every version of you, trembling, brave, confused, hopeful, broken, resilient, has been waiting for your return, not because they need rescuing, but because they hold the very pieces of yourself you've been searching for. The confidence you seek is still held by the version of you who once dared to dream boldly. The tenderness you crave is still held by the version who once loved fearlessly. The strength you admire is still held by the version who survived what should have shattered them. You don't become whole by abandoning your past. You become whole by retrieving it. This is why healing cannot be rushed or forced. It is a pilgrimage back through the emotional landscapes you once fled. It is the courage to revisit the rooms of your own memory where light was scarce. It is the willingness to sit with the parts of you that once felt too overwhelming to face. And when you do, something miraculous happens. The rooms begin to brighten, the shadows shift, and the selves who once hid in corners step forward with relief, because they were never the problem. Your rejection was. Every part of you wants the same thing: to belong, to be welcomed back into the larger field of your consciousness, to no longer be treated as errors or burdens or reminders of who you never want to be again. They want integration, not annihilation, recognition, not avoidance, homecoming, not exile. You may think letting them back in will make you weak, but it is the opposite. The strength you admire in awakened beings is not the absence of old selves, it is the integration of them. They do not stand on top of their past, they stand with it. Every version of themselves is aligned behind their eyes, supporting the clarity and power you see, and this is your path too. You evolve by becoming spacious enough to hold every layer of your story without shame. You evolve by allowing your heart to expand beyond judgment. You evolve by recognizing that nothing you previously were is incompatible with who you are now. All of it was part of the shaping. All of it was part of the preparation. All of it serves your present. Awareness. To invite your former selves home is to gather your scattered power. To invite them home is to return to wholeness. To invite them home is to become undivided at last. And when you reach this place, this quiet, coherent center, you no longer fear your past because you no longer fear yourself. The journey is complete, not because everything has been fixed, but because nothing inside you is left outside the circle of your compassion. This is not transcendence. This is evolution. This is remembrance. This is homecoming. This is quantum quest, where consciousness becomes the experiment.